If the First Lady wasn't in great shape, she would have fallen. But she's in great shape. We're both in good shape. We both stood.
Welcome to Watch Mojo. And today we're counting down our picks for the most questionable decisions and politically fraught moments that left permanent smears on the legacies of U.S. presidents.
An unraveling of a presidency begins here?
It begins right in this space.
Number 30, George W. Bush, the shoe-throwing incident.
Zero.
On December 14, 2008, during a press conference in Baghdad, President Bush faced a moment that defined the tail end of his time as commander-in-chief. As he stood beside Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, journalist Muntadar al-Zaidi hurled his shoes, one after another, at the president, shouting in Arabic, "This is a farewell kiss from the Iraqi people, you dog." In Arab culture, throwing a shoe is an extreme insult, symbolizing contempt. Al-Zaidi was tackled, arrested, and later sentenced to prison, but the symbolism had already landed. For many across the Middle East, the act expressed rage at U.S. occupation. For Americans, it became an almost absurd metaphor for a presidency dodging backlash.
Is one way to gain attention. It's like going to a political rally and having people yell at you. It's like driving down the street and have people not gesturing with all five fingers.
Number 29, Gerald Ford, falling downstairs. In Salzburg on June 1st, 1975, rain slicked the steps of Air Force One, and President Gerald Ford slipped, skidding to his knees in front of cameras and foreign dignitaries. The Associated Press newsreel and wire photos captured not just a stumble, but a narrative seed, a physically awkward president at a delicate diplomatic moment. SNL's Chevy Chase built a recurring clumsy Ford persona, and subsequent missteps, real or exaggerated, were folded into that frame.
I do have two major announcements to make. Whoop, uh-oh. No problem. Okay.
With hindsight, the Salzburg spill is minor next to policy choices, but as an embarrassing presidential moment, it's archetypal, a meme before memes existed.
And now for my second announcement.
Number 28, Barack Obama, the disastrous launch of Healthcare.gov.
Well, we're going to turn now to the latest on Obamacare and the debacle. The White House promising the new federal health insurance website will be fully fixed, but it will take weeks. The problems, and there are dozens of them at Healthcare.gov, are much worse than we've been told.
October 1st, 2013 was meant to showcase a signature reform, the federal marketplace going live for 36 states. Instead, Healthcare.gov buckled immediately. Error screens, frozen forms, and a first-day tally of just 6 successful enrollments, according to internal notes released by House Oversight. President Obama publicly acknowledged the failure and promised fixes, while traffic jammed a site that had been under-tested and poorly integrated.
Of course, you've probably heard that Healthcare.gov, the new website where people can apply for health insurance and browse and buy affordable plans in most states, hasn't worked as smoothly as it was supposed to work. And the number of people who visited the site has been overwhelming, which has aggravated some of these underlying problems.
Investigators later detailed why it imploded: diffuse ownership at CMS, weak systems engineering, shifting requirements, and contractor mismanagement. The Government Accountability Office concluded that ineffective planning and oversight drove cost overruns and undercut launch readiness. By mid-2014, GAO and congressional testimony laid out a case study in how not to ship critical public software.
Media sites across the board are calling last year's debut a rollout disaster.
Number 27, Jimmy Carter, a translation mishap in Poland.
The first time I made a foreign trip as president, it was to Poland. And then I went to other places. But when I got off a plane in Poland, I had an interpreter there. And I didn't write my speech out ahead of time. It was just a greeting.
In Warsaw, December 1977, President Jimmy Carter's warm greetings were interpreted into Polish by freelance translator Stephen Seymour as something else entirely. Lines that made it sound as if the president, quote, desired the Poles and might never return to the United States.
It was a very welcoming group, and mostly very heavily Catholic. And I got out and I told them that I understood that their heritage was one of of commitment to love of freedom. Love of freedom. And the interpreter said that I knew about their commitment to free love.
Polish listeners laughed and winced. The next day, Washington prepared an apology, and the episode instantly eclipsed the intended message of human rights and détente. President Carter replaced the interpreter and soldiered on with the trip. The gaffe didn't derail U.S.-Polish relations, but as presidential optics go, it offered a brutal lesson. In foreign capitals, a single botched sentence can swallow an entire agenda.
Well, it didn't go over well with the audience, and this is you can look it up in the records. It's a true story. And all over the world, I was accused of saying that Polish Catholic people were committed to free love.
Number 26, James A. Garfield, Star Route Scandal. When James A. Garfield took office in 1881, a long simmering graft scheme in the post office burst into view. Star routes, remote mail contracts farmed out to private carriers, had been inflated and rigged for years by a ring centered on Second Assistant Postmaster General Thomas J. Brady and political fixer Senator Stephen W. Dorsey. Despite the drama, convictions were scarce. Brady and Dorsey were ultimately acquitted, thanks in part to high-powered defense counsel. The scandal crystallized the case for civil service reform, helping propel the Pendleton Act through Congress in 1883 and beginning the long retreat from patronage. As embarrassing presidential moments go, Star Route is institutional rather than personal, a presidency forced to grapple with rot in its own machinery. Number 25, William Henry Harrison, his death.
William Henry Harrison may not be first to the hearts of his countrymen, but he's a favorite in presidential trivia contests.
He was the only president whose wife, after the White House was born, never made it into the White House. Poor Mrs. Harrison was still packing back in Ohio when he died.
In March of 1841, former Ohio Senator Harrison stepped into the presidency with much fanfare. A war hero campaign slogan and a grand inaugural address delivered outdoors. What followed was a whiplash reversal. Harrison gave the longest inaugural speech in U.S. history, in cold, damp weather without a hat or overcoat. Within 3 weeks, his health spiraled. He developed a cold that turned into pneumonia, or possibly enteric fever, according to later analysis, and died on April 4th, barely a month after taking office.
I think it's a good thing that they finally learned from Harrison's inaugural that when it was freezing weather during Ronald Reagan's second inaugural, they finally moved it inside.
So help me God.
And canceled the parade.
He became the first U.S. president to die in office, creating a constitutional crisis over succession. To this day, his 31-day tenure remains the shortest in U.S. presidential history.
He's a great lesson in bringing an umbrella.
An umbrella and wearing a hat.
And not making a 2-hour speech. In general, I think we could rally around the idea of not making a 2-hour speech anywhere, under any circumstances.
Number 24, Woodrow Wilson, screening The Birth of a Nation at the White House. When Woodrow Wilson invited guests to the White House for a private screening of The Birth of a Nation in 1915, the act seemed benign, an early presidential embrace of film as cultural diplomacy. But the movie glorified the Ku Klux Klan and promoted racist narratives. President Wilson's decision to host it gave direct presidential imprimatur to a work now widely condemned for reinforcing white supremacist ideology. His broader racial segregation policies, such as the resegregation of the federal workplace, added fuel to the controversy. While Wilson issued a press release denouncing D.W. Griffith's film and its content, he was reported to have enjoyed it, sending Griffith a congratulatory message on its success.
Woodrow Wilson segregated the federal government and segregated the military, which had been integrated from Reconstruction up to the era of Woodrow Wilson.
Number 23, Donald Trump, the UN escalator debacle.
All I got from the United Nations was an escalator that on the way up stopped right in the middle. If the First Lady wasn't in great shape, she would have fallen. And then a teleprompter.
At the UN General Assembly in September 2025, President Trump took to the dais after what should have been a routine arrival and instead delivered one of the more surreal presidential visuals in recent history. As he ascended an escalator inside the UN headquarters, the escalator suddenly stopped, forcing them to walk the remainder aboard. Then, during his speech, Trump remarked on a malfunctioning teleprompter, "Whoever's operating this teleprompter is in big trouble."
A subsequent investigation indicated that the escalator had stopped after a built-in safety mechanism on the comb step was triggered at the top of the escalator.
The White House then accused the UN of sabotage. The organization responded by explaining the escalator stop was likely triggered by a U.S. videographer walking backward, activating the safety mechanism, and that the teleprompter was run by the U.S. team. So, just another day in the Trump administration.
President Trump, however, called it sabotage, saying in part, quote, "It is amazing that Melania and I didn't fall forward onto the sharp edges of these steel steps face first." He also cited a British newspaper report claiming UN staffers joked about turning off the escalators because the UN ran out of money due to Trump's funding cuts.
Number 22, George H.W. Bush, vomiting on Kiichi Miyazawa.
24 hours after his sudden collapse, President Bush looked reasonably fit and well. Guest of honor at another banquet hosted by Japan's Emperor Akihito. He was showing little outward sign of last night's sudden attack of flu.
Diplomatic dinners are meant to project poise and stability. On January 8, 1992, President George H.W. Bush did the opposite. During a state banquet in Tokyo hosted by Prime Minister Kiichi Miyazawa, Bush suddenly turned pale, leaned forward, and vomited into his host's lap before collapsing. Cameras rolled as Secret Service agents rushed to his side, and within hours, the footage was circulating worldwide.
Mr. President, what can you say to reassure people that you're all right, sir?
I feel pretty good. I'm back strong. I've got a 24-hour flu, but I think I had a fair sleep. Slept this morning, still mainly on fluids.
The president's sudden health scare was chalked up to acute gastroenteritis, not a serious condition, but the damage was already done. The incident developed a cult following in Japan, and the spectacle as a whole became an enduring pop culture shorthand for presidential embarrassment.
President Bush flies home tomorrow straight onto the campaign trail. His task now to persuade the American public that his health should not become an issue in this election year.
Number 21, Joe Biden, the first presidential debate.
We make sure we had a situation where we brought down the price of prescription drugs, which is a major issue for many people, to $15 for an insulin shot as opposed to $400. No senior has to pay more than $200 for any drug, all the drugs they can include beginning next year.
The June 27, 2024 debate between President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump was billed as a defining rematch until it became a meltdown. Biden appeared frail and uncertain from the outset, struggling with hoarseness, losing his train of thought, and at times freezing mid-sentence.
What I'm going to do is fix the tax system. For example, we have 1,000 billionaires in America. And what's happening? They're in a situation where they, in fact, pay 8.2% in taxes. If they just paid 24%, 25%, either one of those numbers, they'd raise $500 billion, I should say, in a 10-year period.
Within hours, even friendly outlets called it painful and disorienting. Polls showed a sharp swing in confidence among Democrats, with internal donors and strategists quietly questioning whether Biden should remain the nominee.
Child care, elder care, making sure that we continue to strengthen our health care system, making sure that we're able to make every single solitary person eligible for what I've been able to do with the COVID. With dealing with everything we have to do with. Look, if we finally beat Medicare.
After weeks of calls to step down, Biden did so, endorsing Vice President Kamala Harris to take his place. Harris and her vice presidential pick, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, would ultimately lose the election to Trump and incumbent Ohio Senator J.D. Vance. Number 20, George W. Bush Mission Accomplished speech. In May 2003, 6 weeks after invading Iraq, President George W. Bush gave a speech in front of a Mission Accomplished banner, declaring the end of major combat operations in the country.
Major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
However, the conflict was far from over. In many ways, it had only just begun. The war went on for another 8 years, with the majority of deaths occurring after this speech. When the criticism began pouring in, the Bush administration claimed the banner was requested by the Navy. They then stated that mission accomplished only referred to the initial invasion, not the war. This incident echoed earlier misinformation by the Bush administration regarding Iraq's alleged possession of weapons of mass destruction, despite hardly any intelligence supporting such claims.
What justifies everything is the removal of a threat. I mean, Saddam Hussein, weapons or no weapons, which would have been a threat had he remained in power.
Number 19, George Washington, the Whiskey Rebellion. In 1791, just 2 years into his presidency, George Washington's administration enacted what became known as the whiskey tax.
Not anticipating the hostilities to follow, Congress passed the excise whiskey tax of 1791. Its ripple effects would be far-reaching and incite violent division.
Proposed by Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, its aim was to generate revenue to tackle the national debt incurred during the Revolutionary War. This tax faced staunch opposition from small farmers, who deemed it unfair since they had to distill their grain into whiskey for easier transport and sale. The backlash quickly turned violent, with farmers refusing to pay and even attacking tax collectors.
Pennsylvania farmers lashed out against collectors, tarring and feathering them in certain instances.
In response, Washington personally led an army to quash the protests, but the rebels all fled and no conflict ensued. While Washington managed to suppress resistance to federal laws, the tax failed to achieve its goal and was repealed in 1802. Number 18, Grover Cleveland, sex scandal. During the presidential elections of 1884, Democratic candidate Grover Cleveland was seen as a formidable option, earning voter support for his anti-corruption stance.
Grover Cleveland, known as Grover the Good to his supporters, easily won his party's nomination for president in July of 1884.
However, in the lead up to the election, allegations surfaced that Cleveland had fathered an illegitimate child with a widow named Maria Halpin. Halpin claimed that Cleveland sexually assaulted her, then had her committed to an insane asylum, and put their child up for adoption. When the scandal became public, Cleveland admitted to paying Halpin child support.
This time, his staff didn't even bother to deny that he and Halpin had previously been what they described as illicitly acquainted.
His opponents seized upon the controversy, creating the chant, "Ma, Ma, where's my pa?" which dogged Cleveland's campaign. Despite the shocking sex scandal, Cleveland's supporters remained loyal, helping him secure a narrow victory at the polls. Number 17, George H.W. Bush, no new taxes. By now, voters have grown accustomed to politicians failing to fulfill their campaign promises. But when a candidate centers their campaign around a key issue, they should probably expect to be held accountable.
My opponent now says he'll raise them as a last resort or a third resort. But when a politician talks like that, you know that's one resort he'll be checking into.
That was precisely the case with President George H.W. Bush. Throughout his 1988 campaign, Bush consistently pledged not to introduce any new taxes if elected. He emphasized this commitment at the Republican National Convention, stating,
"Read my lips. No new taxes."
Well, guess what? There were, in fact, several new taxes. Bush's backtrack on this promise lost him the support of many within his party and became a focal point of the 1992 election, where Bill Clinton successfully portrayed him as untrustworthy. This ultimately contributed to his re-election defeat. Number 16, Thomas Jefferson, the Embargo Act. During the Napoleonic Wars, America sought to remain neutral, resisting pressure from Britain and France to join the conflict.
Another European war threatened to spill across the Atlantic as France and Britain once again battled it out.
When the British began forcing U.S. sailors to join their navy, President Thomas Jefferson decided to sign the Embargo Act of 1807, which halted all American exports abroad. Jefferson hoped this would pressure Britain and France to respect American neutrality. Instead, this strategy backfired, as the act negatively affected the U.S. economy, leading to widespread smuggling and protests, especially in the New England region.
All the embargo manages to do is to cause an economic depression.
This was particularly damaging for America, which was a relatively new nation at the time. Faced with growing opposition, Jefferson quietly repealed the act in the last days of his presidency. Number 15, Woodrow Wilson, the Espionage Act and Sedition Act. America's entry into World War I in April 1917, after nearly 3 years of neutrality, was met with significant domestic dissent. To suppress this opposition, President Woodrow Wilson signed two laws, the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918.
But the most memorable provisions of the Espionage Act regulated anti-war speech and made it a federal offense to say or do or publish things that would interfere with the war effort.
The Espionage Act originally aimed to crack down on actual espionage by penalizing interference in foreign policy and military operations. However, the Sedition Act greatly expanded its scope, prohibiting disloyal speech against the U.S. government, which seems to violate the Constitution's free speech protections. These acts resulted in widespread prosecutions targeting socialists and pacifists, including notable figures like Eugene V. Debs.
Eugene V. Debs was arrested. He was tried under the Espionage and Sedition Acts. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison.
The Sedition Act was ultimately repealed in 1920, but the Espionage Act remains in effect today. Number 14, John Adams. The Alien and Sedition Acts. Woodrow Wilson wasn't the only president to suppress dissent against the government. Back in 1798, President John Adams enacted 4 laws called the Alien and Sedition Acts, amid concerns of an imminent war with France.
The Alien Bill made it difficult for people to become U.S. citizens and allowed the president to throw any foreigners he wanted out of the country. The Sedition Bill went even further. It made it a crime for Americans to criticize their government.
These acts targeted immigrants and political dissidents who Adams feared would side with France in the event of war. Among the 4 laws, 3 were Alien Acts, which toughened the citizenship process for immigrants and allowed their deportation if deemed dangerous. The 4th, a Sedition Act, punished anyone spreading false and malicious statements about the government.
They were repressive acts.
And Adams supported this legislation, which then just created this enormous debate within American society about what freedom of press, freedom of speech really meant.
Naturally, these acts faced strong public opposition, sparking protests nationwide. This backlash provided leverage for Adams's opponent, Thomas Jefferson, who successfully capitalized on it and won the presidential election in 1800. Number 13, Andrew Johnson. Reconstruction and impeachment. Abraham Lincoln's assassination left Andrew Johnson with the task of reintegrating former Confederate states and previously enslaved people into the United States.
Johnson wanted the post-war South treated leniently. As for the fate of freed slaves, he wanted that left up to the states.
Johnson's Reconstruction policies favored leniency towards the rebels, allowing them to easily rejoin the Union and uphold a system that was essentially still slavery. These policies enraged Congress, which passed laws to counter them, kicking off a bitter struggle with the president. In August 1867, Johnson fired Secretary of War Edward Stanton in violation of the Tenure of Office Act. The following year, Congress impeached Johnson, making him the first president to face such a resolution.
Finally, the bad blood spilled over. The president was impeached and escaped removal from office by just 1 vote.
Although he was narrowly acquitted by the Senate, Johnson's presidency was severely weakened, and he failed to win the Democratic nomination in 1868. Number 12, James Buchanan, his entire presidency. James Buchanan's single term as president occurred in the mid-19th century. Since then, many successors have come and gone, yet several historians still consider him the worst president in U.S. history.
He was elected president in 1856, but this Northern Democrats' sympathies with the slave-holding South exacerbated long-simmering tensions.
This is due to his apparent indifference to the impending Civil War. After his inauguration, Buchanan viewed slavery as an issue of little importance. Instead of trying to lessen the rift between the North and the South, Buchanan believed he shouldn't interfere in states' issues.
He feared that if you handled the issue of slavery too robustly, that it would create what he believed would be the end of the Union, secession.
He had pledged not to run for a second term, and during the lame duck period between his successor's election and inauguration, Southern states began to secede. Buchanan essentially crossed his arms and watched them leave, his incompetence inevitably resulting in the Civil War. Number 11, Warren G. Harding, the Teapot Dome scandal. President Warren G. Harding was in office for only 2 years before his untimely death. But in that little time, he was involved in one of the most shocking political scandals ever.
The Teapot Dome scandal was probably the most significant presidential scandal in American history in the 20th century up until Watergate.
Following his inauguration in 1921, Harding placed his close friends in high-ranking positions, including Albert B. Fall, whom he appointed as Interior Secretary. Harding gave Fall control over 3 naval oil fields, whose drilling rights the Secretary then leased to private oil companies in exchange for bribes. This shady deal was first reported in April 1922, resulting in a Senate investigation.
Congress ordered President Harding to scrap the oil leases. The Supreme Court ruled the leases fraudulent and said Harding's transfer of authority from the Navy to Interior was illegal.
At the time of his death in August 1923, Harding was beloved among the American public. But as the details of this investigation surfaced, his reputation was effectively tarnished. Number 10. Donald Trump, convicted of felony crimes. Before Donald Trump's election in 2016, 44 individuals had served as President of the United States. Yet in 2024, he made history as the first one to be convicted of a crime.
The stunning verdict was delivered by a Manhattan jury of 7 men and 5 women who deliberated for 2 days, making Mr. Trump the first former American president to be convicted of a crime.
The landmark case stemmed from hush money payments Trump made to adult film star Stormy Daniels to keep their alleged sexual encounter under wraps. The prosecution argued that Trump falsified business records to conceal these payments, a felony under New York law. The trial became a media spectacle and concluded with the jury finding Trump guilty on all 34 counts. This case was one of several criminal charges Trump faced, including his alleged involvement in the January 6th insurrection aimed at overturning the 2020 election, which he lost to Joe Biden.
After this, we're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down. We're going to walk down anyone you want, but I think right here we're going to walk down to the Capitol.
Number 9. Bill Clinton, the Lewinsky scandal and impeachment. More than a century after Andrew Johnson's impeachment in 1868, Bill Clinton became the second U.S. president to be impeached by Congress in 1998.
When the dust had cleared, the House, voting almost strictly along party lines, sent 2 articles of impeachment on for trial in the Senate.
Clinton's impeachment was related to an extramarital affair he had with White House intern Monica Lewinsky. Lewinsky confided in her colleague Linda Tripp, who secretly recorded their conversations and handed the tapes to an independent counsel, which was already investigating Clinton on other matters. The ensuing scandal eventually led to his impeachment by the House of Representatives on charges of perjury and obstruction of justice, as he had lied under oath about the affair.
I want the American people to know today that I am still committed to working with people of good faith and goodwill of both parties to do what's best for our country.
Though Clinton was ultimately acquitted by the Senate, the scandal left a lasting stain on his legacy. Number 8. John F. Kennedy, the Bay of Pigs invasion. In early 1960, President Dwight Eisenhower approved a CIA plan to overthrow Cuban leader Fidel Castro. That plan was not executed until the following year, after John F. Kennedy took office.
On April 16th, Kennedy reluctantly agreed to the plan with one major exception. If the operation foundered for the Cuban exiles, the U.S. military would not intervene.
On April 17, 1961, over 1,400 Cuban exiles, who had been trained by the U.S., landed at the Bay of Pigs to launch a full-scale invasion. However, their attempt was dead on arrival. The insurgents on the ground were met with unexpected resistance by Castro's forces and were easily overpowered, especially after Kennedy withheld further air support. Within 3 days, they had all surrendered.
These are 1,400 men. Castro's army is 25,000. The real story here is these desperate men on the beach watching their chances go away, and back in the White House, Kennedy suffering mightily with what to do about this.
The fiasco became a significant embarrassment for Kennedy, undermining his credibility in the international community and escalating Cold War tensions. Number 7. Herbert Hoover, Mexican repatriation. Shortly after Herbert Hoover took office in 1929, the U.S. stock market crashed, which sparked the Great Depression. Hoover's strategy to tackle this economic disaster was to blame Mexicans in the U.S., accusing them of taking American jobs. As a result, his administration oversaw the deportation of up to 1.8 million people to Mexico, many of whom were actually U.S. citizens.
Increasingly important is the 60% or more of American citizens of Mexican descent. In other words, what occurred here was unconstitutional deportation.
Known as the Mexican repatriation, this scheme was carried out through raids, roundups, and pressure tactics that forced many individuals to leave voluntarily. Unsurprisingly, this did nothing to ease the Great Depression, which ended up contributing to Hubert's defeat in the next election. In 2005, the state of California formally apologized for its role in the repatriation.
The state of California went on to issue a formal apology for its role in the expulsions and built a memorial in downtown Los Angeles to commemorate the victims.
Number 6. Lyndon B. Johnson, escalating the Vietnam War. When Lyndon B. Johnson became president in 1963 following JFK's assassination, the Vietnam War had already been raging for nearly a decade. At first, American involvement was fairly limited, but this changed dramatically under Johnson. The turning point was the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, where North Vietnamese forces supposedly attacked U.S. Navy ships. Although this attack was later disproven, it led to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave Johnson authority to escalate U.S. military actions in Vietnam. By 1967, there were over 500,000 American troops in Vietnam, many of whom lost their lives. Johnson's escalation of the war became highly unpopular in the U.S., sparking nationwide protests and resulting in his decision not to seek re-election.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Number 5. Ronald Reagan, Iran-Contra affair. In 1986, Ronald Reagan and several of his administration officials became embroiled in a notorious political scandal. They had secretly orchestrated the sale of weapons to Iran, which was under an arms embargo, to secure the release of 7 American hostages. The profits from this sale were then illegally diverted to fund Contra rebels in Nicaragua, who were fighting the leftist Sandinista government.
American President Ronald Reagan funnels money to right-wing Contra rebels fighting an insurgency against the Sandinista government.
This was in direct violation of a congressional amendment that banned American aid to the group. When the affair was exposed, it became a major embarrassment for Reagan, raising concerns about his administration's integrity and oversight. Around the same time, Reagan also faced criticism for his delayed response to the AIDS epidemic, which had already been a significant crisis for years.
At the time, many leaders were accused of ignoring the crisis because it was deemed a gay disease. President Reagan didn't give his first major speech on AIDS until 1987.
Number 4. Franklin Pierce, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Franklin Pierce, a one-term president, is often ranked among the worst and most forgettable leaders in U.S. history. Pierce's administration is largely remembered for passing the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. This act created the territories of Kansas and Nebraska and allowed settlers to decide on the legality of slavery through voting.
Pierce signed into law the Kansas-Nebraska Act, allowing voters in the Kansas and Nebraska territories to decide whether to allow slavery within their borders, negating the earlier Missouri Compromise.
Though it was intended to reduce tensions over slavery, the bill backfired, instead reigniting fierce debates around it. Pro- and anti-slavery settlers rushed to Kansas, hoping to outnumber each other and sway the vote. This led to violent clashes between the two sides, known as Bleeding Kansas. Instead of uniting the country, the Kansas-Nebraska Act only deepened divisions, stoking the fires that culminated in the Civil War.
He thought making concessions to Southerners was what was necessary to preserve the Union.
Number 3. Richard Nixon, the Watergate scandal and resignation. Few things are as humiliating for a U.S. president as resigning from office. Richard Nixon was the first to experience this due to his involvement in the Watergate scandal.
We have a mystery story out of Washington. 5 people have been arrested and charged with breaking into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee in the middle of the night.
Nixon was largely popular during his first term, but to ensure his re-election in 1972, his administration and campaign orchestrated the wiretapping of the Democratic Party headquarters. However, the men sent to do the job were caught red-handed and eventually linked to Nixon's campaign. Desperate to hide his administration's involvement, Nixon tried to obstruct the investigation. This was revealed by his own taped recordings, leading him to resign rather than face impeachment.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Ironically, Nixon had already secured re-election in one of the largest landslides in history, which made the whole fiasco pointless. Number 2. Franklin D. Roosevelt, internment of Japanese Americans. Following Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, public opinion in the U.S. slowly began to turn against Japanese Americans. To address fears of further Japanese attacks or sabotage, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066.
Motivated by vocal outcries from politicians and military officials, FDR signed Executive Order 9066, empowering the U.S. Army to designate areas from which any or all persons may be excluded.
This order allowed the U.S. government to forcibly remove and relocate people of Japanese descent to internment camps. As a result, about 120,000 Japanese Americans, many of them U.S. citizens, were uprooted from their homes and forced to live under harsh conditions, simply due to baseless fears of espionage. Years later, the Ronald Reagan administration officially apologized to the former detainees for this grave injustice and paid $20,000 in reparations to each survivor.
It would take over 40 years before President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, paying reparations to each victim of internment.
Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. You have the option to be notified for occasional videos or all of them. If you're on your phone, make sure you go into Settings and switch on your notifications. Number 1. Andrew Jackson, The Trail of Tears. In the early 1800s, tensions ran high between Native Americans and white settlers over the ownership of indigenous lands in the South, which were ideal for cotton farming.
The U.S. government signed a treaty that guaranteed that Cherokee land would be off limits to white settlers forever.
These settlers found a powerful ally in President Andrew Jackson. In 1830, Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, authorizing the forceful displacement of indigenous tribes from their ancestral lands. Between 1830 and 1850, about 60,000 Native Americans were removed from their homes and marched over 1,000 miles to designated Indian territory across the Mississippi River.
Thousands of Native Americans were pulled from their homes in Georgia and other states across the South. Many were shackled in chains and forced to walk at gunpoint more than 1,000 miles west.
Referred to as the Trail of Tears, this journey was brutal and left thousands dead from disease, exposure, and starvation. Today, many scholars view it as an act of genocide and ethnic cleansing against Native Americans. Which of these appalling moments left you shaking your head in disbelief? Let us know in the comments below.